Hi everyone, it's Amy here from the blog I Think Therefore I Teach. Welcome to your next philosophy instalment. This one is going to be for the cosmological argument. So, let's get going. This is a great one, nice and straightforward, pretty easy. So this is part of the existence of God arguments based on observation. So if you get a question in the exam 2022 on observation, you can talk about both teleological and or cosmological as well. So we start with Aquinas. Aquinas is the key name for this argument. He was obviously also mentioned in teleological, so knowing the difference between his teleological argument and his cosmological is very important. What I get my students to do, I'll get them to do an activity in a second. First thing I get them to do is to work out what the word cosmos means. It obviously means universe. Anything logical is the study of, so it's the study of the universe. The cosmological argument is also a posteriori, post sensus. It's based on empiricism, and so therefore you gain knowledge about God through examining the cosmos using your senses. So then I get my students to work through these questions, and we normally spend probably a lesson, maybe even talking and discussing these ideas. And first of all, to talk about them in pairs and groups, and then we should do a class discussion on them because these questions are fundamental to understanding the cosmological argument. So the first is I get them to write what they understand as far as the definition of the universe. And usually I have a scientist or cosmologist or a student in lesson that really does understand what the universe is. And so they can not only give a definition, they can also explain it for number two. How did the universe get here and start? Now, I make it very clear to the students that you can have a lot, you don't have to be religious to believe that it maybe started other than the Big Bang. So you don't have to be necessarily religious to believe it started in another way. But then I get them to discuss, if it isn't God or a deity, why not? And don't say because there's just no evidence. Why is the idea of a God or a deity or a powerful being or something like that, a prime mover, whatever it might be, why is that not a possibility? Why is that not a possible idea? So I get them to actually really think about why that isn't a contender. What does infinite mean? What does infinite regression mean? And is the idea of infinity even possible? Infinity and infinite regression are extremely important to Aquinas. The whole premise of his argument is based on those concepts. So it's important that you understand what they mean and then how they apply to Aquinas. I always like, and I always link it to the Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond, to the ideas that it makes me smile because you can't actually get beyond infinity. Infinity is infinite and therefore you can't get beyond it. So a little bit of philosophical trivia when you're next watching Toy Story. Aquinas' first way then. Aquinas has 5 ways. The first 3 are the cosmological arguments. So as we know, Summa Theologica is his main book where most of his works are found. And he presents 5 ways to prove God's existence using empiricism. The 5th way is, of course, the teleological argument. You do not need to mention that if it specifies just cosmological in the question. But as I said, if it's the questions on observation, you can do both the 5th way from Aquinas and you can do the first 3 ways. But knowing where they fall is important. The 4th way used to be on the old spec and was taken off. So the 4th way was quite dull, so you don't need to worry about that one. The cosmological is the first 3 ways. I'd be surprised how many students get that wrong. So a lot of students do get that simple bit of information wrong. His first way then is the unmoved mover. Everything in the world's in the process of motion. So think of mover as motion. This is about motion and movement. Everything in motion is changing from potential to actual. This should scream Aristotelian. This should scream Aristotle. And you can synoptically link it to Aristotle as well. So obviously motion is motus in Greek. Aristotle talked about potentiality and actuality and how going through the 4 causes. You don't have to go into that much detail, of course, for an Aquinas answer. But placing it within the Aristotelian context does create a nice synoptic link. This state of motion is started and caused by something else. There must be something outside of the cycle of motion that set it off. The chain of movers cannot go back infinitely. This is always the big one. Infinity for him is huge in this topic. It's the idea that this cycle of motion, of change of potential and actual, cannot go back forever. It cannot go back infinitely. It has to start somewhere, and that somewhere has to be something outside of the process of motion. And so the conclusion he draws is that God is the unmoved mover. Then what I get my students to do is I get them to write down what unmoved mover actually means and why it's important that God is unmoved. As it stands on this slide now, you're looking at about a C grade, C maybe low B. You need to explain why Aquinas called him the unmoved mover and why God being unmoved is so important. So unmoved mover means God moves things without moving himself or itself. So God moves without moving himself. Why is this so important? Because if God moved, it means he changes and therefore no longer perfect. If God moves, what's then moving God? Linked to infinite regression, as in what's moving God, what's moving the thing that's moving God, what's moving the thing that's moving the thing that's moving the thing that's moving God infinitely. So the idea of the perfect, the idea of the infinite regression, and the idea that then something's moving, it's also part of the process, which God cannot be part of. God is not part of the process. God is the causer, but not not part of it. He's the unmoved version of this. The second way is the uncaused causer. It's important that you get your first and your second way the right way round. So the uncaused causer. Think of cause as cause and effect. Uncaused causer means cause and effect. Mover, motion. Causer, cause. Cause and effect exist in the world. If you eliminate cause, you also eliminate its effects. So that you cannot have a first cause nor an intermediate one unless you have a first. This is the idea there that you can't have. If you take away the cause, you can't have an effect. You can't have an effect without a cause. And so you can't have a last cause or a middle cause, intermediate one, unless you have a first, because they go hand in hand successively. And so I relate this, I get my students to try and relate that idea to a book. And obviously, how it links to a book is you can't have a middle of a book and an end of a book without the beginning of a book. But there's not endless cause and effect throughout eternity, and so therefore the first cause is created by God. Once again, this is the idea that cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect cannot go back infinitely. There must be something that starts off this process, this cycle of cause and effect, and that being is God. I then get my students to write down, as they did with the first slide, what does uncaused causer mean and why must God be uncaused? So once again, uncaused causer means God causes cause and effect but is not caused himself. Why is this so important? Again, infinite regression. If God is the caused causer, then what caused God? What caused the thing that caused God? So it leads again to infinite regression. God has to be uncaused. He cannot be part of the process of cause and effect. God must be separate from this. So therefore, if everything else in existence is in cause and effect, God must be uncaused and separate from that in order to retain perfection, etc. as well. The third and final way is contingency and necessity. Everything is contingent. Everything in the universe is contingent, which means relies upon something else for its existence. We are contingent. We rely upon our parents for our existence. We rely on oxygen from the trees. We rely on food. We rely on the ozone layer so that we don't heat up and burn alive. We rely on many, many things. So therefore, we are contingent. Our life is contingent on other things. This pattern of contingency cannot go back infinitely. Again, all of these things are tried to avoid infinite. Aquinas did not believe infinity existed. Aquinas did not believe things could go back forever infinitely, in that we can't go us, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-great. You get the idea. It has to start somewhere. Don't say Adam and Eve. It has to start somewhere. And so that being, infinite regression is impossible, as we've said. And so there must be a necessary being, a being that is separate from our existence, a being that is different from contingency. And so there has to be a necessary being. Necessary means the opposite of contingent, and so it's a being that's self-caused, self-created. Therefore, it doesn't rely upon anything else for its existence. Its existence is within itself, and so it cannot not exist. It must exist in order to set off the patterns of contingency, but it cannot be part of that contingency cycle. It cannot rely upon other things. Why? Because if God relied upon other things, then there must mean there's something greater than God. That cannot be the case. So God is the necessary being. That's Aquinas. That's Aquinas in a nutshell. If you get a question on Aquinas, those are the things you have to talk about. Of course, you need to bring in Hume's criticisms, though, as well. So, David Hume's criticisms. Hume's first criticism. Just because things within the universe cannot be explained through causes, everything is caused by a preceding cause, does not mean there is a cause for the universe as a whole. This is known as the fallacy of composition. Now, there's a lot of things I'd like to explain here. The fallacy of composition is the idea that just because things within the universe need a cause does not mean the universe as a whole needs a cause. You can explain the sections, you then don't have to explain the whole. You also need to understand what the word fallacy means. Fallacy is a word used on the spec, so therefore an examiner is expecting you to know the meaning. A fallacy is, and you've got the definition there from the online dictionary, a mistaken belief, especially one based on unsound arguments, a failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid. You can use the word fallacy in an essay against somebody else. It's a mistaken belief. It's a mistaken belief. So the mistaken belief in this case is that God is the necessary being, that God is the uncaused cause or unmoved mover. That's the mistaken belief. The mistaken belief, because it's based on unsound arguments. The unsound arguments is the reductio ad absurdum, the way Aquinas reduces these arguments down to the absurd conclusion that infinite regression does not exist, infinity doesn't exist, and therefore God has to be separate from it, and it's God that is that being. This is based on unsound arguments, and it's a failure of reasoning. Therefore, the fallacy of composition is picking out the fallacies in Aquinas' argument. The fallacy is against Aquinas. Aquinas is the one with the unsound arguments. Aquinas is the one in the failure in reasoning and the mistaken belief. So that's why his argument is invalid. So it's invalid because just because everything in the universe has a cause, you can't suddenly jump to the universe as a whole having a cause, and that's caused by God. That's a leap of logic. It's very important that you explain all of that properly in an essay. We have evidence of causes within our world that we can test, study empirically. It does not mean the universe as a whole has a cause. And David Hume gives the example of 20 particles to explain this. If you find an explanation for every particle individually, all 20 of them, you don't then need to explain the whole of them all together as well. You've explained all 20, you don't then need to explain them as a whole. We've explained all cause and effect in the world, you don't have to explain the universe as a whole. So with this, you need to link it to Aquinas, and obviously you can link it to all three of Aquinas' arguments in that, but most specifically, because it uses the word causes, you most specifically against uncaused causa, that's about cause and effect itself. But you can also say about unmoved mover that just because everything in the world is in motion doesn't mean the universe as a whole is in motion. Just because everything in the world is contingent doesn't mean there's a being that is necessary. So you can still use this argument against all three of his points, but obviously the second one about the uncaused causa is the most obvious link there. Russell supports his argument. Love Bertrand Russell. He said that just because every man has a mother is not proof the human race has a mother. What he just basically philosophically means there is just because we know that every man has a mother and we can see empirically test it, you can't then again do the leap of logic. The human race as a whole has a mother. The individuals have mothers, the human race does not, or does not necessarily. Hume's second criticism, there's only two in this argument, knowing his criticisms and how they differ from teleological is very, very important. You must keep them separate. That is one of the things that the examiners will really be looking at, and it's one of the reasons why they specifically say teleological or cosmological and Hume, because they need to make sure you know the difference between his arguments against the teleological argument and against the cosmological argument. So his second criticism is we assume there is a relationship between cause and effect. We are in the habit of seeing effects and associating them with causes. But just as a matter of logic, not all effects have causes. Some things are just random. Some things don't have a cause. And so he calls this the fallacy of affirmation of the consequent. Fallacy, again, the mistaken logic that every effect needs a cause. Affirmation of the consequent, affirming, confirming, asserting, establishing the consequence, as in the consequence, the outcome. So what he means is we cannot affirm from the outcome that there's a cause that goes with it. We can't assume that that cause is then God either. So that's a fallacy. Overall, we have not experienced the creation of the universe. We cannot prove empirically that there is a necessary being or that being is God. We can't also necessarily prove Big Bang. I know there's more evidence for the Big Bang, but again, we still weren't there. J.L. Mackie supports this and says, why should people accept that God is the necessary being? Equally, you could argue that it's a permanent stock of matter whose essence didn't involve existence from anything else. That's the idea there that, fair enough, it was started by something, but why God? Why not just a permanent stock of matter? That's very much like the steady state theory, the idea of matter, or even the Big Bang as well. So its essence didn't involve existence from anything else. It's still obviously therefore necessary. It's self-caused, but why does it have to be a being? Finally then, a few extra points and arguments that you can use to plump out an essay in your evaluation. Don't forget once more at this point, I must make it clear and remind you that just by stating Hume's arguments, you're not evaluating. They're Hume's arguments, they're not yours. So therefore, you're not evaluating anything. You're just stating a fact that that's what he says. Yes, what he says is a criticism, but it's not your criticism. In order for it to be your evaluation, you have to then evaluate Hume's criticisms. You have to evaluate Aquinas. Just by putting in Hume, J.L. Mackie, Bertrand Russell, you're just stating the facts. It's a fact that he criticised Aquinas. That's not your evaluation. Your evaluation has to be an analysis of Hume, a critique of Aquinas, an evaluation of these names and whose argument is therefore better. There are two types of statements that are found within language. This is not just philosophically, this is just within language as a whole. And these ideas come in throughout philosophy and also a bit of ethics as well, near meta-ethics. So there are two types of propositions. A proposition is a statement of truth. They are analytical or analytic and synthetic. Basically, an analytic statement is a statement of reason, logic. Logic within itself is a definition. It's true by definition. So, for example, all bachelors are unmarried men. They are. Bachelors, unmarried, same thing. That's true by definition. The logic is within itself. You can deny it and say, no, bachelors are married. You're just wrong. On the other hand, synthetic is when using names or people, you need to prove it. So Herbert is a bachelor. Sorry, any Herberts out there if you're not bachelors. It sounds like a bachelor sort of name. Herbert is a bachelor. That might be very well true, but you would need to find Herbert to prove that he is therefore not a bachelor. Even if you found Herbert and went, oh, Herbert's got a wedding ring on, he isn't a bachelor, it's still got meaning, it's still understood, even if it's false. That means true or false means that it's meaningful. If something does not fall into analytic or synthetic, though, it becomes meaningless. Bertrand Russell used this logic. He did not create that logic. That logic is just there, but he used it against Aquinas. He said that only analytical statements are necessary. So Aquinas says that God is a necessary being. Russell is saying no, the only thing that is necessary are analytical statements. The truth is within themselves, the meaning is within themselves. They're self-explanatory, self-created. That only those types of statements are necessary, not a being. You cannot have a necessary being like God. A being or God is the name of something. And so therefore it's not analytical like how Aquinas uses it, it's actually synthetic. Because you're talking about God, you need to find proof that God is the necessary being, the uncaused cause or unmoved mover. And because you can't, it then just becomes meaningless. He also adds in that why can't the universe itself simply exist without a need for explanation? As in, you don't have to explain God, so why can't the universe itself just be what doesn't need explaining? Cause and effect will stretch infinitely into the future, so why can't it stretch infinitely into the past? No need of a first cause. If God is the explanation of everything, and everything requires an explanation, then what is the explanation of God? Finally, why should God be self-explanatory in the way the universe is not? The other arguments that you could mention, of course, are things like infinity does exist, like infinite numbers. Pi is an infinite number, for example. So Aquinas obviously didn't know about that back in his day, so he didn't see infinite as possible, and therefore everything has to start somewhere. Motion, cause and effect, contingency. But actually, infinity does exist because we have things like infinite numbers. So you can use that again in your answer. Two arguments then that you do need to know. You need to know a bit about the Big Bang. You need to know a bit about the steady state theory. It's not enough to put there was a bang and it was big. You need a bit more than that. The Big Bang could explain the start of the universe. About 15 billion years ago, there was a dense concentration of matter and energy. This massive energy exploded, blasting particles and energy outwards. The matter then concentrated into hot lumps we call stars, and these stars are clustered into galaxies. But there's still a debate on what caused Big Bang. Was it natural or divine? Did God actually start the Big Bang, or did it just happen? Again, you can discuss and debate that. Those are the sorts of words that you need to use. You need to use things like energy, explosion, particles, the idea of concentrated hot lumps. You need to use that in your explanation. You need to show an examiner you understand. You don't have to do it like a scientist, but you need to show an understanding about the Big Bang and why. You can't just say the Big Bang is better than the idea of God because there's evidence. What evidence? You need to tell me what the evidence is. You need to find out why is the Big Bang more convincing, because I guarantee you do not know why the Big Bang is convincing. You've just been told it is. You need to explore and research why actually is the Big Bang more convincing, and that will then really develop your essays. The steady state theory is the idea presented by Bondi, Gould and Hoyle that energy cannot be created. Energy within the universe will simply be redistributed to cause the start of the universe. Basically, you can't create energy. Energy is just there and it's moving around at the beginning of time. And when it's been redistributed, as in distributing around, distribution, moving, at a certain point things collided and then everything began. So it's a bit like the Big Bang theory, but it's about the idea of the distribution of energy. This undermines the cosmological argument and how God is the beginning of the universe. And as I said as well, another argument you could use that's just a general one, if infinity is impossible, but God is infinite, so why should God be able to be infinite and the universe not? I then get my students to discuss, can these fallacies be overcome? Can Aquinas defend his argument? And are the arguments against the cosmological argument too strong? Who's winning at this point? Are you Team Aquinas or Team Hume? Who is more convincing? Can Aquinas defend against the fallacies that he's been accused of making? Or is his argument just too flawed? Finally, the arguments defending God as creator. I love this argument. And again, it's not necessarily a defence, but you can use it as a defence. You can also use it as a critique. It's Leibniz, again, apologies for the pronunciation of the name, like the biscuit. His argument from sufficient reason. First of all, I have to say, impressive wig. Very impressive wig. The cosmological argument rests on certain principles of causation. Leibniz himself never really looked at the cosmological argument. It's more us applying his theory to this argument. In particular, that any existent thing must have a cause or a reason for its existence. So what this is saying is that the cosmological argument rests on certain principles that everything that exists There must be a cause to it. There must be a start to it. It can't go out forever. There must be a reason why it's here. And so this is what Leibniz points to in his principle of sufficient reason. There cannot be more reason in the effect than there is in the cause. What that means is there cannot be more in the outcome than in the cause itself. Your effect is lesser than the cause. And so it's the idea that what we have in front of us, what we have in the universe that we see is spectacular. The world, the ozone layer, the formulation of how everything works, the gravity, how the seasons and everything is entwined together. It's amazing. There has to then be an even more amazing cause to this. There cannot be more on the effect. This is the effect, the outcome, which is already amazing, than there is in the cause. So the cause has to be even better and greater than this. And so that's all he says. That's all the argument is. He's not saying, therefore, it's God by any means. But what you can then argue is this might then imply God rather than just a Big Bang. So all his argument is just the argument of sufficient reason, in that there has to be sufficient reason why things happen. There has to be more in the cause than there is in the effect. That's all he argues. He's not arguing for or against the cosmological argument. It's how you then use it for or against that gets you the marks. So he's by no means saying it's God. You can just fill in the blanks if you wish as part of your argument, that therefore it could be, because maybe God is more of a sufficient reason than the Big Bang. But that's your argument, not his, just to be clear. Finally, further supporters' arguments from Contingency. You have Frederick Copleston. Frederick Copleston used to be on the old spec. You do not need to know him now, thank goodness. He basically just said exactly the same argument again, and I found it quite dull. Apologies anybody that did like the Copleston argument. I always like an argument that actually says something different rather than just the same thing. But Frederick Copleston, I think he was a reverend. He says objects in the world depend on something else for its existence. They are contingent. Therefore, explanation for existence of everything in the universe must be external from it. There must be a being that is self-explanatory, contains within itself the reason for its own existence, and then therefore that's a necessary being. He's basically just re-explaining Aquinas' third way. You can of course use it as a supporter because he's agreeing, but just because he agrees with it doesn't mean it's a good thing. The Nazis agreed with Hitler. It didn't mean that it was a good thing. So you have to be, you'll have to do more than just saying it's supported by. You still need to argue why that's a good thing. The Kalam argument. Muslim scholars Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali, what's nice about this is it's not just Christian perspective. This is a Christian argument because Thomas Aquinas is a monk, Christian monk, whereas obviously this does, bringing in Muslim scholars is a nice variation. Everything has to have a beginning, including the universe. The universe cannot go back infinitely. There must be a God who willed it to begin. And so obviously they're using the word God more loosely. They might be meaning more Allah. But this is the idea there that they're once again agreeing that the universe has to have a beginning and it can't go back forever, and that God is that potential being. William Lane Craig, interestingly, used to be a critic. He used to be an atheist, and then in a debate, he pretty much, somebody was counter-arguing against him, and he pretty much there on the spot was like, that's a really good argument. And he, at that point, changed his view. So looking at William Lane Craig is quite an interesting one. He said, no such thing as infinity. We know that's not true. If the universe is not infinite, there must be a beginning. The beginning must be caused by something. And for Craig, this is a personal being. So that's a bit of extra stuff you can talk about. This makes it a bit different and a bit better, in that he's not specifically saying God, he's just saying a personal being. But of course, he is implying for him that it is God. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use any of these names on this slide. In fairness, I don't think they really add that much to the argument anyway. But if you do use any of them, do not just describe their points. Use them evaluatively. Use them as part of your line of argument. Don't just restate what they have said. Otherwise, you'll get far too much description. Fabulous. Right, folks, hopefully you found that useful. Please give me a thumbs up if you did. Any questions you have, pop them below. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any videos. Otherwise, thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.